Pick up where we left off. We had a question. Fruit fly species all look more or less alike, right? They're flying around your kitchen, and you can't really see the difference between them. If you have a male and a female fruit fly, how can you prove that they're the same species? Is it determine the base sequence of the DNA of their chromosomes? Can you do that in your house? Anybody have a sequencing machine or abilities in your house?
In the basement next to the heater.
Okay, let's keep our eye on Naz. Okay, so no, you can't do that. Examine them closely with a low-power microscope, comparing their physical characteristics to published species key lists of characteristics. Just because, like us, if aliens came and they looked at all of us, they might not think we're all the same species because we all look a bit different, right? They would have to figure some other way out. So while that sounds kind of good, no, not really. If they perform the act of mating, then they are the same species. Didn't we learn the other day that there are pre and post mating mechanisms, or pre-zygotic and post-zygotic, where they could perform the act of mating but not have, what's the key thing there? Fertile offspring. Okay, so that's not necessarily true. If they mate successfully, this implies mating successfully that they have an offspring, and then their offspring can also mate successfully. So it's not just that the original pair can mate successfully, but their offspring are fertile and can mate successfully. All are the same species. I like that one. That one sounds really good. If they can both asexually reproduce, right away. That gives me a clue. We're talking about sexual reproduction. So, no. So the correct answer is D. Anybody any questions on that? Big part of evolution, that a population can keep themselves going by having offspring who are fertile and can have the next generation and keep the population moving into the future. So we talked about the separation of species, but how do new species arise? It's a process called speciation. Speciation, by definition, is that the changes based on natural selection, the way that individuals in the population are affected in their survival by the current environmental conditions, might favor some in the population over others. If you are favored because you have advantageous characteristics, you have an easier time surviving in that change in the environment. You have more time for mating. If you're the same species, then you can have fertile offspring who can then also go on, survive easier because they have the advantageous characteristics in the current environment, and they can keep that population going. If there's enough of a change in the environment where you've got a group that easily survive and are adapted and aren't, we can start to see like a loss of these in the population, and the allele frequencies of this population that's an easier time surviving start to go up because they're more favored. And eventually what could happen is that change in the environment eventually leads to these becoming a different species from these. So it depends on two processes. One is isolation and the other one is genetic divergence. All right, isolation. You're isolated. There's no gene flow between you and other populations of your same species. Because you are isolated, you may be experiencing the process of natural selection differently. Which I mean by that is that if you're isolated in an environment, let's say that you're a species and you go like the founder effect and you move up to the top of a mountain to get away from overcrowding in the general population, and you move to a place that is really different from where the original population is, that you may start to experience natural selection differently because you went somewhere really, really different. And so what is favored may be very different. And so being in those two drastic different environments and what is favored will start to change in terms of allele frequencies. So what was favored down here is not going to be favored up here. And so those with the advantageous genes up here are going to survive. Those with the advantageous here is the advantageous genes over here is much different. So you might see that we get a big change between the two species because they are experiencing different environments where different characteristics or traits are favored. And so over time, those different favoritisms that are happening lead to different species. Genetic divergence. Remember this term, divergence, is that you have a common ancestor, and then you have from that population, just like what I said with the one going to the mountain, one staying down here. Genetic divergence means that you have characteristics that you share from a common ancestor, but you start diverging or going away from the environment of the common ancestor. You start experiencing what is favored differently because you're in a different environment. You experience the process of natural selection differently. So remember, like, vertebrates all have a common ancestor who has the same bones in their forelimbs. We have a common ancestor, and then within that common ancestor, they start to reproduce, and we get a population, and some in that population start to have mutations, for example, where their forelimbs, they start to get lighter just by chance. There's chance mutations. And they realize, well, my bones are getting lighter, so if I flap my forelimbs, I can fly. So they go off into the environment of living more so in the sky and high in the trees. That's genetic divergence. Remember, divergence is you're going away from. Remember also that characteristics like homologous structures and vestigial structures show genetic divergence, right? The differences in the forelimbs, for example. Differences in teeth, that molar. We don't need that anymore, but it does show a relationship to a common ancestor. So it is isolation-based. There's two forms of genetic divergence. We're going to take a look at those two forms. The first one is allopatric speciation. A geographical barrier happens. Boom, there's a lot of rain. Rain makes a huge river that separates our populations. One ends up on lower ground, one ends up on higher ground. One ends up in a very wet environment, one ends up in a very dry environment. Those in the wet environment who can maybe swim or deal with very humid conditions will do better than those in the dry environment. There's different things that are favored here. So this is usually like a quick catastrophe happens. A mountain range. There's an earthquake and boom, a mountain range goes up. And it separates a sunny side and a dark side. This is the most common kind of genetic divergence. We see it happening a lot nowadays with climate change, that within a population something changes really, really quick and they get separated. They experience the process of natural selection differently. Here's the big thing. Prevents gene flow. Gene flow means that members of the population can mate successfully with one another. They can pass their genes amongst each other. You get that separation, they can't do it anymore. They each encounter natural selection differently, which means that they experience evolutionary processes independently, evolutionary pressures of who's favored, and now the separated groups differently. This means that some are favored over others in the different environments. Maybe in the regular environment, you had all the advantageous genes, but now you're separated because there's a big mountain. And what if you're on this side where it's really, really dark and cold because the mountain blocks the sun, and you had you were real skinny, and you had thick fur. Sorry, you're skinny and thin fur. That doesn't work in a cold environment, right? You're going to just be like, all you're going to be doing is searching for a place to get warm. If you're freezing, you're not going to be thinking, wait, I can just mate. Mating constantly will make me warm. You know, you're just like trying to really figure out, which is maybe true, but you can't just constantly be mating, right? That takes a lot of energy, and then you can't get food because you're cold, and so it doesn't quite work out. So you may be favored, and then this genetic divergence event happens, and now you're not anymore. So you're not favored anymore by the environment. Let's say that over time, that mountain starts to shrink. So that mountain that went up because there was an earthquake, you get this mountain. And then over time, that mountain starts sinking. And let's say that it's 1,000 years, or it's 450 generations. When that mountain finally sinks enough that the two populations who've been separated can come back together, we can figure out, are they the same species still? Because just like in our question, we can test that if we have members of those two different populations and they mate, they have offspring, and their offspring are fertile, then they are still the same population. But if they come back together and they mate and their offspring are infertile, or they can't have offspring at all, then we now know we've got two different species going on now from one original population. So one example, we've got green lizards, and these lizards, these three, it would certainly be a lot more than three. But just visually, if we have the small population, and three of them, they're like, what's this thing by the shore? And they all get on it, and then it starts moving. And they're like, whoa, we don't swim. And then they get over to this other island across the way. Perhaps that you can see kind of a mountain here that shades them, that favors the green characteristic, but over here, it's sunnier, so the brown characteristic is favored. We might see that over many, many years, they become different species. The other kind of speciation is called sympatric speciation. There's no geographical barrier. This is like ecological isolation in that they live in the same place at the same time. They're around each other all the time. But likely, it starts to get really crowded in the environment. And because they all share the same niche, there's a lot of competition. And so what we know about evolution is evolution does not favor those with a lot of competition. Evolution favors those who have less competition. So within the same environment, it starts to get crowded and you have the same niche, you might start thinking to lower my stress and my competition factors, what I should do is I should start specializing in different ways than everybody else. And so if, let's say that you just happen to have longer nails or claws than everybody else eats on the ground because they can't climb the trees, and you're like, wait, I've got these claws that most others don't. What me and everybody else with the long claws, let's get them together and we'll be like, hey, we have long claws, so we can climb up and we can get the food up there. And that'll hugely alleviate our competition for food. Also, we can live in the trees. We can make our habitats up there. We can have our babies up there. And so now what you've done by just taking one aspect of being able to climb a tree because you are favored by you happen to have longer claws, you climb up and you've totally changed your niche. And you've made your life a lot less stressful. You've made for a lot less competition. But right, you're up here and they're down there. You're in the same environment still. But you have lowered your competition or your competitive niche factors. We call this niche specialization. If you have a lot of competition, you look for ways where your characteristics could benefit you right now in a different way than everybody else. Just like if you're on a dance team and everybody's kind of doing the same dance and you're like, but I can do gymnastics, and you add a couple flips into that dance, now you're much different than everybody else. You've capitalized on the characteristics that you have in that situation to become advantageous. So, like here, we've got a bunch of flies that are all living on this tree, and some of them who fly really well, they're like, we can fly all the way over here, and we can live on these other trees that normally flies of our kind don't live on. So now you can see that they have two different environments. Also, the two different trees have different sized fruit on them, and some of them who can fly further and eat the bigger fruit are like, we have a totally different niche specialization here to lower our competition. And then there's mutations, which we've been talking about all along, that mutations, just by chance things that come up in the copying of the DNA from the parent to the offspring, can lead to new ways to keep you isolated from others. We see this in plants, and I'm pretty sure we've all experienced this in seedless watermelons. We'll talk about that. Plants are super duper weird. If you're a botany person, or you're going into like ecology, or you're doing like a general biology degree and you take a botany class, you'll find out plants are real freaky. They do all kinds of things that most other organisms can't do. So with one of the things that I talked about last time was that DNA, when humans have 46 total chromosomes and you get 23 from sperm and 23 from egg, and they come together to make that zygote, and then it starts to become bigger and bigger to become an offspring. That having, let's say that in the process of the making of the sperm, that in the copying of it, they end up with maybe a little extra DNA or a whole chromosome, that can have very destructive effects on the offspring. Having more DNA might be like, more is great, but it's not. You want the same amount. You want the same gene banding patterns, because more DNA can cause you to have more proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, and those things can overwhelm our general systems and cause disorders to happen. With plants, they can have whole extra sets of chromosomes. If we had a whole extra set so that when the sperm or the egg are being made, and we want them to have 23 and 23 to make two pairs of chromosomes of 46 total, that let's say that a plant has 10 and 10, but in the making of the sperm, they get 20 and 10, 30 chromosomes total when the chromosome number is 20. That's a lot, but they do fine. It's called poly, meaning many. You get many extra chromosomes or extra sets of chromosomes. They could have one. What if they both are polyploid and that you get a chromosome number, you got a chromosome number 20, right? We want 10 and 10, and you end up with a sperm with 20 and an egg with 20. And now you have a chromosome number of 40 instead of 20. So they could have 2 or even more. They could end up with 3 or 4. And they do okay, but what can often happen are two things, is that polyploids become isolated from those that are just kind of like doing their normal, regular copying of the sperm and egg. And the polyploids then find out they're isolated from the regular, kind of quote-unquote normal chromosome number. And so that polyploids can then only mate with other polyploids. Sometimes the polyploids result in offspring that can't reproduce. Seeds, watermelon seeds, seeds of any produce, they have an offspring in there. Each seed is potentially an offspring, right? There's no seeds here, no offspring. So, because, like my son he always says, oh, does a watermelon have the black seeds in it? Oh my gosh, you gotta spit them out. He wants these ones. And sometimes they might have seeds that are white that have no gametes in there. Not gametes, zygotes in there. So you might get the ones that have the white seeds that are real flat, and that's from a polyploid, that the result of them being polyploid is that you do get the white seeds, like this one. Sometimes you get them in the regular watermelons, or maybe I shouldn't say regular, but the seeded watermelons. And this one, it just doesn't have any embryo inside. And you often will get them also in the seedless watermelons. So there's a whole process of making sure if someone who sells seedless watermelons, they have a seedless watermelon farm, they have to keep mating the polyploids to keep getting offspring, because you can't make them from the offspring. Okay, so allopatric speciation, there's a geographical barrier that separates. This is ecological when we're talking about sympatric, that they live in the same place at the same time, gets crowded, there's a lot of competition, and so they start to do niche specialization. Either one of these situations, if you look 100 generations later and you try and mate these two together, if they can have fertile offspring, they are still the same species, but if they can't have fertile offspring, they have become different species. Since the Pleistocene Ice Age, a long, long time ago, deserts have been gradually forming in the southwestern United States. As the original lakes and rivers of this area shrank from connected streams into isolated streams, the fishes living in them developed a strong potential for speciation, hybridization, polyploidy, temporal isolation, introgression. So one of the things that I know a lot of you all have to figure out, that and kind of think back, if I haven't mentioned this word or this word, cross them off. It's just let me give another biology fancy sounding vocab word that doesn't mean anything in this situation. So already just kind of like thinking like, talked about this, we talked about that, we talked about that, so but I'm gonna get rid of that and that. Boom, boom, cross them off. And then you just have to think about the definition of this, this, and this. Which one's the best in this situation? Boom. Okay, in this situation right here, would this be an example of allopatric speciation or sympatric speciation? Which one was the geographical barrier? Allopatric, yes. Yes. We have extinction events that are natural. Remember that climate change has always been happening. It's accelerated. There's more impact on the climate because of what humans do right now. So I keep emphasizing to understand that when someone says, I don't believe in climate change, you can be like, you're dumb. Because like dinosaurs went extinct, right? That was climate change. Climate changed. There's ice ages and warm ages and ice ages and warm ages, right? So when people say that, I'm always like, you know this is true. This is not true, what you're saying. Think about it. The environment changes. It's always doing something. We just impact it more. Get this, 99% of all the species that have ever existed are gone. Yeah. There are these events. I'm going to skip that today. So what makes you vulnerable as a species to being affected by climate change? So there's a couple things. You are susceptible to extinction. If you're a cute panda bear. Panda bears live in the mountains, and they generally feed on one kind of food, bamboo. This also blows my mind when you have those, like, my minds, I have many more. My mind, when you have a really big creature who's a vegetarian, an herbivore, and they're big, right? But so they're eating tons and tons and tons of bamboo. If there's a fungus that starts to affect the bamboo, or climate change gets too warm for that bamboo to grow in the mountains, what if those panda bears are real picky and they're like, well, there's a lot of other plants we could eat, but I don't want to eat them. Or maybe they can eat them, but they don't get the right nutrients to thrive. So one is that they live in mountains, right? They're big, they like cold weather. The bamboo that they're eating is cold weather bamboo. What if they come down from the mountain and it's too hot for them? They don't have a way to cool themselves off. And they're just so over-specialized. They eat like one thing. If that one thing has a problem, you have a problem. Poor cute panda bears. Also, your interactions with other species can have an effect on whether you are vulnerable to extinction. So, competition, you don't have the ability to specialize your niche in different ways. You could have a lot of competition. Your predators become bigger in numbers. Remember that lynx and the hare, how when the bunnies, the hares, their population starts to go up, so do the predators. Predators go up, start eating them, bunnies go down, not enough food, the predators go down, so you can have that effect on one another. Or parasites, just like what I mentioned with the bamboo. If you're very specialized and then a fungus comes and parasitizes your food, you're in trouble. And then the humans, we always have an effect on things. The highest rates of extinction they believe are happening now due to humans. As I mentioned, climate change, which is the acceleration of climate change right now, which is exacerbated by humans, is affecting every species on the planet. We, pushing climate change, affects the vulnerability of every species on the planet to go extinct. One way is that we just keep building. Like if we wanted to make more parking lots, we got rid of our nature study area, wouldn't we remove a lot of species that live there just because we want to park our cars, which negatively impact the environment? Now we're going to do it in another way. We're going to destroy habitats of organisms, so we give them the double whammy. All right, so what are the benefits of preserving biodiversity? And then we talked about this in ecology, that it's ethical. Should someone go to the rainforest and burn down 100 acres of rainforest so they can grow pineapples and make a profit quickly? Is that ethical? No. And then think about ecosystem services. What are we destroying that can help us to thrive better as humans? What if we destroy a keystone species? Everything can fall apart. The whole community can fall apart. Okay. Let's go on to the next. We're going to talk about the history of life. So in this part of lecture, I want to remind you that when we're looking at the origin and history of life, while we do have some data to support, we know like this came after this and this came after that, but how life started, the Big Bang, all that stuff, we don't know. It's hypothetical. So I'm going to give you some hypothetical data to start with. We have what is documented as prebiotic evolution. What was the Earth like before bio-living things? How did the Earth evolve in a way that set up the likelihood for living things to flourish? Prebiotic evolution. Evolution before living things, before life. So we know that the Earth was created, or well, we think the Earth was created by meteorites crashing into each other and then starting to go on a rotation around the sun. And the distance from the Earth and the sun and the bubbles, the atmospheres that were made to hold in heat were really good conditions for life to start. There are a lot of inorganic molecules. One day, I'm going to fix this. I keep forgetting methane is an organic molecule. So just kind of write organic. Organic molecules have carbon with hydrogen covalently bonded to them. So methane is an organic molecule. Just to know, it's a very small one. There was other things like ammonia, which early on, like we know ammonia now is toxic. We have a liver in our body that can make that less toxic. We form ammonia when we eat protein. So an offshoot of the metabolism of protein is that we get ammonia, and then quickly, boom, a hydrogen connects to that, and then that goes to the liver, and the liver changes it into something that is not toxic. We know ammonia is very dangerous, but early on it was favorable. That organisms who could live in this toxic environment thrived. Got some hydrogens, and there was tons of water. And water, if we think about the importance of water, like hydrated and dehydrated, that whole thing revolves around our ability to make and break molecules. So if you are dehydrated, you have a really hard time surviving because you can't perform your metabolism. There was no free oxygen, free meaning by itself. There was oxygen in water, but it wasn't by itself. Free oxygen is what drives our current metabolism through cellular respiration. Plants, as they go through photosynthesis, they release oxygen, and that oxygen, along with our food, help us to metabolize better pieces of energy, ATP, for our cells. So while back then, an oxygen-free environment was favorable to organisms, eventually we're going to see that that becomes very unfavorable. And we get a shift in genetic divergence. All right, the Earth is like 3.9 to, I've even seen 4.4 billions, about 4 billion years old. So remember back when, like Buffon was like, I think the Earth's like 6,000 years old instead of 2,000, and everybody thought, you're crazy. We found out it was like, wait, older than that. The meteorites, chance, totally by chance. And primitive Earth was really, really different than it is today. Very toxic in comparison to what we have now. Just different organisms were favored in that environment. All right, so what it looks like, kind of looked like this. There was a lot of energy, they believe. Again, hypothetical. There were meteorites, there was lava, there was electricity in the form of lightning, so all of these things could make reactions go faster. And that's one of the things that they believe, by having all of these different energy sources may have sparked molecules to react faster, which eventually led to small organic molecules. A lot of water though. Based on evidence of looking at cores of the Earth, they believe that there was a lot of water, that the majority of the Earth was covered in water. So as humans, we have evidence to show that we came from something that was swimming. Or we have a common ancestor with something that was swimming, I should say. All right, so the first steps. Take all of those small organic and inorganic molecules. Energy sources make them react faster. And you start to get small biomolecules like a protein. This amino group comes from the toxic ammonia and those hydrogens, and then various other groups that make proteins different from each other, and carbon dioxide might become a carboxyl group. So all these come together and they start to make small organic molecules. There's the Miller-Urey experiment. This is not proof of how life started. This is an experiment that supports the idea of how on primitive prebiotic Earth that life could have come about. So again, their experiment is totally hypothetical. So they took these closed systems and they put water and electricity sources and small organic and inorganic molecules. They changed the recipes for what molecules they put in, and what they found over time in this closed system was that eventually organic molecules started to appear. That the reactions of these small inorganic molecules with the electricity sources led to small organic molecules. And we are made of organic molecules. We're made of what we call biomolecules. The biomolecules are based in organic molecules because all of our biomolecules have a carbon backbone with hydrogens attached to it. Then we get other things that are attached to make the nucleic acids and the proteins and the lipids and the carbohydrates. So just after a few days of doing these reactions in this closed environment, they started to get proteins, carbohydrates, nucleotides, ATP, which is super critical to our metabolism. ATP drives our cellular reactions. That's the result of cellular respiration. Additional organic molecules, if you've ever heard that term, we're all made of stars. This is the idea that from outer space, the crashing of the meteorites brought molecules that weren't there before. Well, nothing was there before, so we're all kind of extraterrestrial, I guess, in our basis. This is what the Miller-Urey experiment looked like, super simple. And I think in terms of like showing what prebiotic life would have looked like, you take, just like evolution, where simple evolves into complex. A lot of times, and this is something to remember as you go on in science, is that sometimes the simplest solution is the best one. What's that, Occam's razor, right? Is that the concept? That sometimes you're like, I got all this knowledge, I'm gonna make this super complex thing, but start simple and build on those concepts. And that's what evolution did, and just as scientists, where we should start. So they took a very simple system. They made a closed system. So what they couldn't escape, and, well, except for some water vapor. They used electricity sources. They used some fire here to boil the water, and they used some electricity in this chamber over here, and they put in a variety of very simple inorganic and organic molecules. And they put in some flow of cool water, so it would go hot to cool off, and after a few days, what they got out were some simple organic molecules, ATP, things that life evolves around. So they're kind of showing this could have been simple Earth, early Earth, prebiotic Earth. Maybe not. Maybe something went and started it all. Who knows? Okay, so we do have evidence eventually that simple organisms have a common ancestor with each other, go into different environments, experience a process of natural selection differently, and we have genetic divergence. So we're going to start getting into evidence that we have based on fossil records, and now we're starting to, if you find a fossil, they're trying to see if they can extract some viable DNA from inside the cells that they find in the fossils, and then we can compare biomolecularly organisms. So all those evidences of evolution is where this starts to kick in, and we start to know at this point that simple organisms evolve into more complex organisms, and that all organisms have common ancestors. The groups have common ancestors. Okay, so organic molecules contain carbon bonded to hydrogen, start to form. Probably on that wet Earth, there's probably places where rocks stuck up, and around those rocks there were these small protected pools, like tide pools, if you've ever been somewhere where the ocean is going in and out. And then you have these areas that are kind of like closer to the shore, and you have these pools of water, and then inside of those pools you see other living organisms that are adapted to living in these very dynamic environments. So what they thought was, like in the Lyra Ray, was that you get these isolated areas that had certain molecules in them, and then with like a lightning strike, you could have gotten those molecules to develop. So we call this, or these like tide pool areas, the primordial soup. It was like thick and gooey with atoms and molecules and made for a good environment that life possibly could have started there. If you remember these terms, monomers, small molecules, give rise to polymers. Bigger molecules, mono, one, poly, many. So you get these chains of simple single molecules that chain together and make these poly, many complex, larger. All right, so the first cells, who knows? Who knows how the first cells came about? We don't, nobody knows. But, and even this, like, people go back to different areas, like philosophy. So there's a lot of scientists who study this like prebiotic Earth area, and they come up with experiments and data to show how it may have started, and then they go to conferences, and then they like have a meal together, and they're like, no, I'm right, and they can't really prove anything together, but they talk about it, and they get ideas to build on those ideas. So there's still a lot of debate of how life started, and we'll probably debate that until we go extinct, because who knows? Here's the thing that we know about evolution. A lot of what is based in evolution is by chance. So could have that like prebiotic evolution to biotic evolution, could that have happened by chance, right? Just meteorites by chance crashed, and then you got like the whole process we just talked about. Could that have happened? Maybe. But we do know that mutation, which is a big driving factor in evolution, along with the environment, we know that these changes, mutations, and the environmental changes happen by chance. So we do have this kind of idea in evolution that nothing can be fixed, nothing can be made to happen, but it all changes by chance. We're going to take a look at the history of life and compare it to a 24-hour clock. So in the inside here, we have how many billions of years, like what 4 billion years ago, when the meteorites first crashed, was about here, was about maybe like 245, 250 on the clock. So it happened very early in our 24-hour timeline. And then maybe like another half, maybe quarter of a billion, well, maybe 1/10 of a billion, I should say, years later, we get the first prokaryotes, and we'll define these terms of prokaryote. Prokaryote means before nucleus formed. So we get these simple organisms like bacteria or archaea, the domains that we know about today, very simple organisms. And then because we had a really rough environment, right, it was toxic, we said there was ammonia, we said there was no free oxygen, that these simple organisms, which are still around today, we have a lot of prokaryotes, probably more prokaryotes than any other groups of organisms, definitely more than the Eukarya domain. So we have them around for a long time. And then a key thing happens, key thing. You might want to note this as the key thing in evolution right here. We have organisms that have a mutation to form something like a chloroplast that starts to pump out oxygen. And then, like, nothing's happening, right? In this toxic environment, not much is happening. This happens, and then look at all of the evolution that happens. So we'll get to that. Humans, look where we're at. We're so young in this big picture of the clock of evolution. We are babies. And look at how much destruction we did in that amount of time to all of these other organisms. Okay, so the first living things came about pretty soon after, maybe like 1/10 of a billion years after evolution, after the Earth was created. I know on the objectives it says know the dates. I don't want you to know the dates. Like, you don't have to be like, the Earth was 4 billion, these were 3.5 to 3.5, because the dates are debatable. I want you to know the order that things happened in. Okay, so make note of that when you're studying. Don't know the dates. I don't care about the dates. What is important is the idea that, like this, I want you to know the order things happen in, and know there's a huge gap here. Huge. That's what you gotta know. Okay, so first living things were prokaryotic. Pro means before or no. Before or no. Karyotic refers to a nucleus. Karyotic refers to nucleus. So the term prokaryotic means before the nucleus or no nucleus. That we have organisms that evolved without having a nucleus. I'm going to get to all that in a little bit. They were anaerobic. An means no or before. Aerobic means oxygen. An anaerobic organism performs their metabolism, processes their food without oxygen. So again, an anaerobic organism processes their food without using oxygen. It's a very, very simple form of metabolism. Very simple. There's a huge difference. Well, I'll get to that too. Okay, so eventually you have mutations that lead to groups like the cyanobacteria. Cyan is like a bluish green, purple color, right? What's cyan? Blue, green? What color? Light blue, yeah. So it had like a little bit of blue and green in there. So cyanobacteria, what happened was there were mutations that led to them having something like a chloroplast. And what we know chloroplasts do is they do photosynthesis. They're the organelle that do photosynthesis, and what that leads to is that you end up with an organelle that produces food, right? C6H12O6, sugar. Sugar goes through metabolic pathways. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time talking. Sugar goes through metabolic pathways and becomes all the other important things that we need. All the other important foods we need. So you don't eat, right, your diet, you don't eat sugar only, right? So we eat sugar. But you don't only eat sugar. You eat fruits and vegetables and grains and meats and things like that. So that is the basis of it. So I always say, when we're talking about photosynthesis makes not just C6H12O6 or sugar, it makes all of our food with oxygen. And then we as heterotrophs, we get our food from some other source. We use those foods and oxygen to turn that food into very small packets of energy called ATP that fuel our cells. Cyanobacteria started to carry out photosynthesis. Free oxygen accumulates about 1 billion years after the Earth was created. So we start to get oxygen. We know oxygen, as an oxygen is released because of its need to covalently bond with two other things, oxygens, boop, join together and make an O2. So oxygen at this time starts to build up. So here, back then, we have a lot of organisms that found or felt oxygen as toxic because they've been living in an anaerobic environment. They did well in the toxicity that we call today, but oxygen, which we need now today, they didn't do well in that. So organisms, so as you have the cyanobacteria or cyanobacteria-like organisms that started to pump out free oxygen, simultaneously you had organisms that had mutations that could live in the environment of that toxic oxygen. So this is important. This is important. You might want to star this. were you, I would hypothesize that my professor is going to ask a question about the most significant thing that happened in evolution for our existence. So this is kind of essentially what we're looking at when we're talking about anaerobic respiration. There's no oxygen, right? There's no, oh, I'm a dum-dum. Oh yeah. Oh my gosh, I'm so dumb. I'm so dumb today. Sorry. Don't get 3 vaccines in a day. My brain is super foggy. I told my husband and my colleagues, I was like, I'm not sure about lecture today. So I'm sorry. Okay, respiration. When we're talking about respiration, it's not just breathing, it's really at the cellular level that we process our food. So we don't have oxygen to process our food here. We end up with respiration, right? Give off carbon dioxide. We get 2 ATP. These are the small packets of energy that we're going to turn our big food into small packets of energy that our cells can use better. They're going to produce something not so great for the cells, like alcohol, which is very dehydrating, or lactic acid, and a lot of heat. Okay, so now, when we have this thing that happens, this mutation, we get the use. There are organisms that can do aerobic with oxygen to break down our food. And we give off some carbon dioxide, some water, some heat. And here's the big difference. Sometimes 38 in muscles. The usable energy within our cells, there's a big difference, right? You get 2, and you get something that's not great for your cell. But here, we get some good stuff, right? Water, carbon dioxide leaves into the atmosphere. We always get heat in any biological reactions. We get a lot of usable energy. They do the same thing. They both break down food, but one does it more efficiently because of oxygen. So oxygen in the atmosphere made for a big difference in what cells could do, how much energy cells had to do stuff, which led for a quick replication of cells or offspring cells, daughter cells, and we get a lot of changes in what's favored in our environments. So that's key, super key. Oxygen, oxygen, oxygen. We wouldn't be here if that mistake didn't happen. We're too complex to have developed without this by chance thing of the cyanobacteria having mutations that allowed them to utilize something like a chloroplast to put oxygen into the atmosphere. Then, by chance, mutation 4, taking our organelles, so like before this time, our cells had very simple structure, very few organelles. And here's the thing, is that in their cytoplasm, the DNA was just floating around. So if you're undergoing this, and something not great is released into your cytoplasm, might that have an effect on your DNA? Yeah, you don't have good DNA, you can't make offspring or you can't replicate your cells. So that was a bad situation. But eventually what happens is that we have a mutation that you start getting these secondary structures around your organelles that allow for the ability to control what goes in and what goes out. And you could keep things out of your cell, out of your organelle. So when you have metabolism that produces not great things, you can control, like, now, this membrane is going to allow the DNA to not be exposed to it. So it gives you a better chance of surviving as a cell. So eventually what we see is that all of the organelles start having these membranes. And there's control within those cells, there's control within those organelles to what comes in and out. And so that's a lot better of a situation. So these membranes were pretty key. They happened about 2 billion years ago. All right, so how did this happen? How did these pop up? There's what's called the endosymbiont hypothesis. Okay, so what may have happened was that you had this big predatory cell, and that predatory cell comes upon a bacterium that's anaerobic, that can do this. Aerobic. I was like, you have a cell that can do this. So you're like, oh, I'm hungry. And then you have this little cell that's like, I can make a lot of energy in these smaller packets that can help feed me. And this I'm hungry cell sees this one and it's like, I could eat you and get energy from you, or we could live symbiotically and I could kind of let you live under my skin. And you could do this and share this with me. Sounds good, right? Okay, so eventually they have this symbiotic relationship. Then the cell is like, this is good situation, but I'm still hungry. And comes across something that has the ability to photosynthesize, has the ability to make this within your body. Wouldn't that be awesome? If something could live inside of our cells that could make the majority of our food, and you didn't have to, you could go to the grocery store and just pick up a few healthy things, but all you had to do was sit out in the sun, and 90% of your energy needs were made within your body. Oh, it'd be so much cheaper and convenient, right? So, I'm hungry, comes up and says, I'm gonna do what I did with that mitochondria-like thing. I'm gonna give you a home. Boop. And we end up with cells like the cyanobacterium who can photosynthesize, and the products of photosynthesis feed cellular respiration, and the products of cellular respiration feed photosynthesis with a bit of sunlight. So as long as you have sunlight available, these two are just making the majority of what you need. And now that cell that was all like swimming around a lot is like, I can chill a lot more. I have an easier time surviving with my two symbiotic organelles. It's a good hypothesis. And one other thing is that these cells had membranes, that they had happened to evolve and have the ability to control what came in and out. So where we got organelles that had membranes may have come from this concept here, the endosymbiont hypothesis. Then eventually the DNA gets encapsulated also in a membrane, and we get eukaryotic cells. Eu means true, karyotic means nucleus.
There was a question here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Question, may I look at the question?
Yeah, there was like two before that also.
Oh, I'm not. Oh. Okay, so let's go to page 39. As a result of the cyanobacteria undergoing the process of photosynthesis, what did they put into the atmosphere? Oxygen. Good, good, good. C. I want to write that down. And then aerobic metabolism is an advantage over anaerobic metabolism because A, the metabolism of glucose with oxygen generates more food. Thank you for letting me know. All right, let's go to that last question at the bottom of 40. Which of the following would be an advantage of multicellularity? That A sounds good. What else sounds good? B sounds good. What else sounds good? They all sound pretty good. There's all advantages there. So the answer is all of the above. Do not assume that it has all of the above, that's the answer, but read all of the choices. Because sometimes students will circle A and move on, and then they come up and they say, why did I get this wrong? I'm like, because you didn't read the whole question. Okay, so we get the eukaryotic cells, true nucleus. That's the domain we are in, the eukarya, because we have, in the majority of our cells in our body, we have nuclei. Eventually, cells came together, lived as a group. They formed colonies, meaning that a lot of cells live together, like if you had a bunch of roommates in your house. And you have the house structure, so you live together, and then you make agreements, like you have like a chore thing, where you're like, I'm gonna clean the kitchen, you do the laundry, you clean the bathrooms, you do the grocery shopping, so that kind of assigning different jobs to everybody in your colony or your group makes things easier, makes survival easier. We do have some organisms today that still are colonial, because it just works in their environment. Cells got bigger. The predators couldn't eat them. They had more time for fighting predators, because they lived in a group. They're like, you big strong cell, you're going to defend us. We're going to do everything else. Cells started to specialize. They may have become the different organelles that we have in our cells today, all these specialty cells. We're in water still. So a lot of our water organisms, like kelp, which eventually we know green kelp, that's where plants came from, green algae. And we get simple organisms like sponges, like jellyfish. So we start again with simple. We're moving, right? Simple to complex. First animals lived in water. First animals lived in water. The first animals lived in water. A lot of times students don't remember that fact. The first animals did not live on land. They lived in water. Did I tell you that? Probably want to mark that so you remember that, because a lot of times students are like, oh no, first animals were on land. Our vertebrate ancestors were first in water, and then eventually got to land. So even 1 billion years ago, we've already gone through 3 billion years. organisms are still thriving in water. Then land got invaded. Okay, there's mutations that allow organisms to fight gravity. Water, which is key for our metabolism, wasn't as readily available on land. So you had to make sure you had some connection to get water. Sunlight could be good, but too much sunlight, not so good, right? So you had to find an area that had water, that maybe you're still kind of mushy, so that gravity is still rough on you, and maybe it'd be good to live land and water, or on the border of water, and you needed some shade, because all of a sudden, like you can go deep in the water and be shaded. So there's some good things, good things if you have the right evolution, bad things if you don't. Reproduction, if your gametes swam in water, you gotta make sure there's some water around. The good thing is nobody else is there. You have mutations to deal with all of this stuff. Nobody's there, no predators. You can thrive if you had the right mutations at that time to withstand all of this. Okay, first land plants were about 475 million years ago, so now we're in the millions. They evolved waterproof coatings because sunlight is hot, so you could get dehydrated. So still today, plants have those cuticles or waxy coatings on them. They all have varying degrees of waxy coatings. Desert plants have more wax. They had specialized tissues to get water from their roots up to their leaves and the sugars and food that was made here down. They had to figure out how to reproduce. They might have done it in water, but eventually you have mutations that allow for seeds, like pine cones. There's seeds in pine cones. Flowers, which attract other organisms to help you with reproduction. So you have an evolution happening here. A lot of mistakes were made and kept life going. Fish had mutations that gave rise to being able to go onto land. We call these the lobe-finned fishes, the front limbs. What they could do is climb, they could crawl around, they could go and they could crawl from water area to water area, but still use land. And the other thing is their stomach had a lung-like ability where it could extract oxygen. They kind of look like that. Or that. Mud skippers are very similar to what we think early fish looked like. Eventually the fish have a common ancestor with the amphibians. You have the ability to breathe through your skin to supplement that stomach pouch with skin breathing. Amphibians still do that today. They have primitive lungs in comparison to other vertebrates. They have to live closely tied to water still, because they still breathe through their skin. And their eggs are still kind of jelly-like, and their eggs have to be laid in water. And we do see that the embryos are very fish-like. Tadpoles look like fish and go through a metamorphosis to go from water and sprout legs and make lungs from gills. So we see that connection. And then eventually you have some mutations that have a common ancestor with the amphibians to the reptiles, where the eggs have a waterproof coating. Snakes, lizards, they have a leather-like egg that doesn't get dehydrated in the air environment, so they don't have to stay close tied to water. They get better lungs, more advanced lungs. They don't have to breathe through their skin, and their skin becomes scaly and more waterproof. And then eventually we have the mammals and the birds come about. We have mutations that happen, give rise to the birds and the mammals. Our ability to take that loss of heat and incorporate it into our metabolism to make our body temperature more consistent all day long as we go from being ectothermic, where we lose heat as reptiles, not we are a reptile, but our common ancestor, to being endothermic, where we keep the heat in. Insulation, feathers and fur, like you put on a coat, right? Coat of feathers, coat of fur, makes you warmer. So now you can regulate your body temperature better, and you've got a covering so you can exist day and night. A lot of organisms couldn't exist at night because it was too cold. So now the birds and reptiles can take advantage of this huge, like half the day. So birds like us can undergo temperature regulation, activity, day, night. Wings were for flying, but then eventually we have birds who specialize in different ways to have wings but don't fly. We see a transition animal, a common ancestor between the birds and the reptiles, in Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx had both bird characteristics and reptile characteristics, so a common ancestor for the branching of those two groups. And then eventually we get the mammals, who at first were really little, stayed out of the way of the dinosaurs, could exist at night up in the trees away from the dinosaurs who were active during the day. Kind of looked like all these little small ones. Another huge benefit is they could grow their babies inside of their bodies. And the biological female could protect their offspring and feed their offspring as they grew. It's better than leaving an egg somewhere and, like you're like, I gotta leave the egg, I gotta go get food. You could just bring it with you and maybe not even, like, your predator doesn't even know. Kind of hide it. Mass extinction events happen throughout the history of life. It's the sudden disappearance of a lot of species due to some chance event. The worst mass extinction was about 245 million years ago. 90% gone. The dinosaurs went about 65 million years ago, and we thought, it's believed, that a meteorite crashed into the Yucatan Peninsula, stirred up dust. The dust didn't allow sun to filter through. Big plants, algae, couldn't thrive, so the big herbivores couldn't thrive, and the big carnivores and omnivores didn't have food. So it's a chain event. But the little mammals could eat little food and thrive.
There's another question.
Oh, another question, thank you. Which evolved first? Remember that animals first evolved in water. On this question, make sure you recognize animals first evolved in water. So which one is true? So C says, did you say C? D says, prokaryotic cells, it sounds good, oxygen accumulated, eukaryotic cells came, multicellular life, animals, and then land plants. So D is correct, because animals were in water and then land plants came about. Eventually we had, I know we talked about continental drift a bit. I just read an article that said in like 250 million years, we're gonna have like it was like a super Pangea or another Pangea, where all of the continents come together. So they're moving toward each other again. So we went like this over time to have all these separate continents, and then we're gonna basically go backward toward this again. Adaptive radiation is when there's a mass extinction event, and whoever has the characteristics that are favored at that time can just start to like take over. So dinosaurs go away, and the mammals are like, woohoo, mammal party, we can invade everything now. That's adaptive radiation. Radiation, it radiates. For sure. One more.
She has a climate change and yes.
Sudden events. Oh, nuts, we got